Good afternoon, everyone. Tonight, it is with great pleasure that we welcome back Associate Professor Knut Ødegård, a distinguished figure in the history of our institute and the former director, for a captivating lecture on Tegea. Dr. Ødegård currently holds the position of Associate Professor in Ancient History and Classical Archaeology at the University of Oslo, where he also earned his PhD. His academic journey includes a research fellow position at the Norwegian Institute at Rome during his graduate studies, and a prestigious tenure as the director of the Norwegian Institute at Athens from 2003 to 2007. His extensive research interests span a wide array of topics, including urbanism in antiquity, economy and settlement patterns in the Mediterranean, religion and antiquity, and society in antiquity, late Roman and early Byzantine history and archaeology. Professor Ødegård has made significant contribution to these fields, evidenced by his extensive publication record, which includes peer-reviewed articles, contributions to edited volumes, and monographs, such as his most recent book on Greek and Roman history, published in 2019. Currently, he's working on the publication of the year 3 volume, which will present the results of the field surveys he directed in the area of Tegea. In addition to these notable survey projects, Professor Ødegård has also directed the most recent excavations at the site of Tegea in collaboration with the local FRA. Furthermore, he directed the field survey on Naxos and co-directed another archaeological project on the same island alongside Dr. Athanasoulis, focusing on the environs of the Apaliru site. All these endeavors were carried out under the auspices of the Norwegian Institute at Athens. For tonight's lecture, Professor Ødegård will delve back into the world of Tegea through the examination of the findings of his and other Norwegian research work on Tegea. He will illuminate issues central to the foundation of Tegea and aspects of the state formation process there. With eager anticipation for this enlightening lecture, I will now invite Professor Ødegård to the podium. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to him.
Thank you, and it's very nice to be back in Athens and also to give a talk, which perhaps is not surprising, given that it's the Norwegian Institute that it is on Tegea, where we have been working for, well, as long as the Institute has existed, actually. We started out in 1990, and only, well, about a year after the Institute was founded. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is basically, well, it's sort of two parts. One part is more about what we know about the period when urbanization and state formation happened at Tegea, which is, you know, archaic and classical periods. And the second part will be more hypothetical, because that's basically dealing with everything we don't know about Tegea. But we might still have some ideas about it. So there won't perhaps be that much exactly new findings, but hopefully something new in the sort of the total impression that you will get during this lecture. Now, as I said, let's see, that works well. No.
Is it on? Let me see if it's on. I don't know if it's on. Try it now.
Oh, I can always use these. So it's
yeah, but probably this doesn't work either.
Okay, and then in that case.
Yeah.
There it is. Yeah, exactly.
Working now.
Let's hope so. As I said, I will draw from the rather extensive Norwegian fieldwork at Tegea, starting, as we said, in 1990 with the excavation under the direction of my good friend and colleague Erik Østby in the sanctuary of Athena Alea in 1990, and then continuing with the field survey in the urban area, or what we believed then to be the urban area of Tegea, from 1999 to 2001, basically. And also I will deal with the geophysical work we did there from 2003 until 2007. And we have been doing other survey work also, Norwegian scholars, for instance, my colleagues Hege Bakke-Alisøy and Jørgen Bakke, who did a more extensive survey of the surroundings of the plain of Tegea some time ago now. And then finally, the Hellenic Norwegian excavations at Tegea, which took place between 2010 and 2014. An excavation in exactly the center of ancient Tegea. So these are the projects that I will sort of draw freely from in this talk. And of course, we are going here to Arcadia and more particularly the plains of Eastern Arcadia sorry, can I get that off again? Or, sorry, right here. I think I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, anyway. As I said, the plain of Eastern Arcadia, and Tegea is in the southern part of this plain. Of course, historically speaking, the plains of Arcadia have been extremely important, also because they have a much higher agricultural potential than most of the other mountainous area of Arcadia, which the region is more well known for. And of course, that explains quite a lot about the historical importance of towns like Mantinea in the north and Tegea in the south of this Eastern Arcadian plain. Now, what I will speak about is mainly about state formation. What can we tell about when does the state as such appear in this area in the historical period? And then we have to, of course, address also the extremely widely discussed topic of what is a polis, what constitutes a polis. And of course, I will here not go deeply into that. I will mainly say that it is, of course, the idea of town and country, the idea of citizenship. It's an idea of a political community with common decisions and things like that. And it is a pleasure to also record the important contributions made to this topic of the Copenhagen Polis Center under the direction of Mogens Herman Hansen, both on the definition and use of the ancient sources, but also, of course, the extremely impressive catalogue of ancient polis that they have produced during the time of this center. Now, when it comes to Arcadia, the most important thing is, or the most important study on this is Thomas Heine Nielsen's monograph from 2002, who asks the questions on whether the communities of Arcadia were organized as polis or when they were organized as polis. And he uses many of the definitions of the Copenhagen Polis Center in the criteria for, when did they become polis? Like, city ethnics, the physical centers, temple building, formal decisions, inscriptions, coinage, and also interstate relationship, wars, treaties, that sort of thing. And of course, Thomas Heine Nielsen has quite a lot to say about Arcadia and quite a lot to say about Tegea as well when it comes to these criteria and whether we can sort of name Tegea as a polis rather early or not. But it is in a way, and his publication was in 2002, as you can see. His sort of conclusion is rather, in a way, also a bit strange. Because on one hand, he says that archaic Tegea is quite well attested. On the other hand, he says that we simply do not know anything about urbanization in Tegea in the archaic period, for instance. which leaves us a bit uncertain about when did actually Tegea become a polis? What was the sort of state, if there was any, before it became a polis? And that is exactly into that field that I'm going to talk for you tonight. Now, so the question is, first of all, what do we now know? I mean, since Thomas Ein Nielsen's monograph was from 2002, what do we now know? I mean, that's more than 20 years ago now. Well, we do know a little bit more. But I will first of all go back to this really pioneer study of this area, which is from 1892 to 93 by Victor Bérard, who sort of tried to establish a sort of rather hypothetical line of fortification. We know it's hypothetical because we haven't solved it yet, so it's really hypothetical. But he also had some ideas about the center of the town. He thought that the sanctuary of Enalea was inside the walls. Well, quite a few different things, but it's important as a sort of seminal study for the topography of Tegea. Now, what do we know about the sort of the center? Where was it situated? Well, already from Bérard, and even before that, actually, we more or less knew where the center was, and that was in no small measure because of the testimony of our old and good friend Pausanias, because he says in his description of Tegea, he says that not far from the agora, a very typical Pausanias expression, is the theater. And of course, the theater has been known for quite a long time under the Middle Byzantine Church. And you can see the foundations here. So it's more or less given that the center of Tegea was very close by the theater. The local Euphoria in Tripoli made some excavations in that area in the 1980s, not properly published, but they did find quite a lot around the theater, mainly, I have to say, late Roman monuments. And we are now virtually certain that what was termed the Agora excavation is not really correct, because they did not excavate in the Agora, but close by. But anyway, we do have a little bit of information on the center, or we did have a little bit of information on the center of Tegea also before our studies. Now, the first and most important objective of the Norwegian Arcadia survey, our first survey in Tegea from 1999 to 2001, was exactly to sort of document the city. I mean, the extent of the city. Where was it? How big was it? What sort of periods were present and things like that. And this is the area. This is the Temple of Athena Lea. This is the theater over here in what's called Palea Episcopi. And we did the survey in this area, but also a bit further to the north to sort of delimit the city area. And that was done by normal archaeological field survey methods. And this is the sort of rather, well, a bit sort of superficial, but still an important result. This is an interpolated map of what we found of the density of archaeological material on the surface. And where it's quite clear, you know, this sort of black dot on the map is rather clear that, okay, this is the urban center of Tegea during antiquity. This is from all periods, I have to say. So it's from Archaic period to the Middle Byzantine period. But anyway, the impression you get is quite sort of obvious. We had more or less the, let's say, the extent of ancient Tegea. And one interesting fact about this is that the sanctuary of Enalea is down here, and it was presumably then outside the urban area. It was an extra-urban sanctuary and not an urban sanctuary. Now, this is the theater, by the way, just to keep you sort of track of where you are, more or less. Now, what about the chronology of our finds? As I said, this interpolated map you just saw was mainly, that was all periods. So it's not really very, doesn't say much about when. But when we go into the more details about it, this is all, I mean, this is all our fields that we walked, 300-400 fields that we walked during the survey. And this is the Archaic period. And as you can see here, I'm always a bit envious of my colleagues who say that pottery always sort of litters the surface. And it doesn't really litter the surface at Tegea at all, and particularly not in the Archaic period. As you can see, we do have a bit of finds here and there, mainly up here, as you can see, which is a votive deposit. That's why it's such a sort of really high up there. But we do at least have a little bit of material. I should say at this point that before the Archaic period, we really hardly have anything. We have a few, very few stray finds of late Bronze Age cups, for instance. We have a Neolithic stone axe, but that's clearly sort of stray finds. It's not really any consistency in the finds at all before the Archaic period. And you can say that this is not much, but it is at least the first sort of consistent picture we get of the finds in the urban area of Tegea. If we go to the classical period, it's already far better, as you can see, because then we have at least finds from, fairly sort of good concentration in the urban area, but also quite a lot on the adjacent hills to the north. And it's quite evident that it's sort of a clear development from the Archaic period. So we can say that during particularly the late Archaic to the classical period, we get a situation where we at least have some archaeological documentation that something is happening in the urban area. Okay. Well, I guess that's probably dealt with by process. No. Okay. The next stage in the documentation was the geophysical survey, or more properly speaking, the magnetometric survey done by Dr. Tatiana Smekalova from 2003 to 2006. Rather simple, and I should say a rather old-fashioned, perhaps by now, magnetometer survey that she did, sort of handheld instrument, but which gave Tegea immediate results, I have to say. This is the sort of raw data. And for you, those of you that know how to interpret images from magnetometer, the blue areas are the areas with higher magnetic content than normal, while the red is the opposite. So you get this sort of changing colors in the images. And what is quite evident here is, for instance, you can see a blue line going here, and it seems to continue up there, for instance, which we are now quite certain that it is ancient road or ancient street. Quite a number of different things, of course, that are present here, but let's just stick to that. That's her interpretation of the thing, and that is exactly this field down here with a street going like this, a sort of the street is the yellow one, and probably a long building like the Stoa on right to the north, and a road going up towards the north as well, and well, sort of minor roads as well, streets in the town. This meant that we could sort of get this together with the archaeological documentation we had. Here is again the fields with density from all periods, I have to say, but here with the additional thing of the urban grid of Tegea, which we have documented then by magnetometer. And I'm very happy for this map because my colleague Jo Simon Stokke made it during the weekend, so it's brand new even. But at least here you can see the sort of the results that we were getting with the survey and the magnetometric survey, I mean, up to 2007. Now, we can then tell from these these two different projects that there are, in fact, some drastic changes in settlement and building activity in the urban area, probably, well, at least from the late 6th century BC. And that is not only what I have showed so far, but also from, for instance, finds of Doric capitals from the late 6th century from the urban area. So, I mean, we don't have only pottery, we don't only have the streets, the urban grid, so to speak, but we also have monumental buildings in this area from, at least from the 6th century, late 6th century BC. Now, this is the sort of reconstruction of the urban grid of Tegea. Long, narrow blocks, as you can see. The basic module is 25 by 75 meters, probably sort of reflecting a foot unit of 100 by 300 foot or something like that. And with a really huge agora in the middle. And as you can see, the streets do not connect, and there are no streets in this area. Huge rectangular space of about 350 meters long. So it's an unusually large, big agora. And the question is, of course, there are many questions, but one of the questions is, okay, when is this, when can we date, or can this be dated? Well, based partly on, of course, what I have mentioned already about the surface finds, but also on the typology of urban foundations and street plans, street grids, and things like that. We do believe that this is clearly an archaic foundation because if we look at the sort of history of urban planning, we can say that archaic town plans are usually characterized by block, the relationship between width and length of 1 to 3 or more, while classical town plans are usually characterized by much more quadratic or square blocks. And the best comparisons are to be found, quite obviously in a way, in southern Italy, where you have so many urban foundations, like, for instance, these two, Poseidonia or Pestum and Metapontion, which present quite a few things in common. Both of these are slightly earlier or somewhat earlier than Tegea, probably. But for instance, the unusually large agora in both towns, they are even bigger in Metaponto and in Poseidonia than at Tegea, but still, I mean, it is a feature of these town plans that they have unusually large public areas, agora, in their plans. So it's clearly in this tradition that we must see the urban foundation of Tegea in the archaic period and not in the classical period, because the hippodamic bands are quite different in type than what we have at Tegea. So we do believe that the foundation must be somewhere in the late 6th century or something like that. At least that's what the plan sort of suggests and the surface finds. Now, since we have come this far, it's okay to sort of sum up some of the main points about the urbanization at Tegea. First of all, as I said, there are hardly any sort of consistent archaeological finds in this area before, let's say, around the middle of the 6th century. So there's no reason to believe that there was anything, I mean, at least important as a center in this area before mid-6th century. And the orthogonal town plan of Tegea itself would suggest a brand new urban settlement, also without much constraints of, property lines and things like that. It's sort of made afresh, so to speak, from scratch, more or less. And I should, of course, also add that this is, in fact, one of the really earliest, if not the earliest, orthogonal town plan of mainland Greece. I mean, because most of our other examples are, of course, from colonial foundations elsewhere. But the question is, does this mean that the polis sort of or the polis of Tegea came into existence in the late 6th century? I mean, is there sort of correlation between the urbanization and the state formation as a polis? Well, that's the question, and that's what I'm going to discuss in the last part of the lecture. And we can return a bit to the criteria for a polis mentioned earlier, which I sort of took from Thomas Heine Nielsen, namely these factors: the question of city ethnics, physical centers. Well, I've already talked a little bit about the physical center of Tegea. Temple building, formal decision, inscription, coinage, interstate relations. I won't speak about coinage at all because I don't really have anything new to add about the coinage of Tegea, but I will say a little bit about the other points. Now, about the toponym and the city ethnic, I won't go into details. I will only say that at Tegea, it's quite clear that the population had both Arcadian and Tegean identities quite clearly. And there's no question that Arcadian identity was already existent in the Archaic period, if not quite early in the Archaic period even. That's quite a possibility. About Tegea itself, well, it's known as a place in the Homeric catalogue of ships, but also in Hesiod, and of course also in later sources, like Pindar, for instance, but there are also numerous references in Herodotus, Thucydides, etc., often referring to a period further back in time, I mean, 6th century at least. So Tegea is definitely a place name that was in use in the Archaic period. I think we should conclude, as Thomas Heine Nielsen also concludes. So there's no question that the name itself was common and was in common use at a rather early date, probably. Now, what about temple building, which is also an important factor here in the question of state formation? Well, this is the urban area of Tegea. Just to put you in the picture, and the map I have borrowed from my colleague Jørgen Bakke. And of course, we do have the temple of Athena Alea, and the temple, which I'm going to speak a little bit more about in just a short while. We have the stone temple from the late 7th century, but we have earlier temples as well at Athena Alea, as you know. We do have a sanctuary at Aios Sostis probably of Demeter, from also probably the 7th century. At least the finds are from the oldest finds are from the 7th century. We have what's been termed, but that's basically mostly because of Pausanias, the Temple of Artemis in Doliana marble from the mid-6th century to the south towards Sparta. We have a very fresh and new evidence from a small survey conducted by Mari Malmer in recent years, south of Tegea, which shows a small settlement, perhaps with the sanctuary. I will talk a little bit more about that too in a short while, from the late 8th to the 6th century. And we have a sanctuary of Demeter up here, which might also be 7th century, at least the cult statue or the main statue from the sanctuary, which is in the National Archaeological Museum here in Athens, is at least second half of the 7th century in date. All this means that temple building, or at least sanctuary activity, was definitely in place in most of the Tegean territory, at least by the 7th century, and certainly by the 6th. So it's quite clear that this goes further back in time than the urbanization itself. And about this, of course, the sanctuary of Athena Alea is perhaps the most important one. And I will briefly just say some of the main results from the excavations directed by Erik Østby here, and particularly focus on the early cult buildings, which are well known, and which are also very small, I have to say, from the late 8th to the early 7th century. I mean, this building is only 2 meters wide or something like that, in wattle and daub and clay. The same as this one, which is a bit bigger, but still, I mean, these are fairly small buildings, of course, and very different from what was erected there in the late 7th century, where you have these this really impressive and important temple of Athena Alea, with the foundations marked here in blue, in Doliana marble, which is a completely different scale and really quite different temple than the predecessors going back a century earlier. So quite clearly, they were building temples at Tegea before the urbanization happened. Now, this is, of course, temple building is an indication of an organized community, at least when it's of the size of the late 7th century to Athena Alea. And of course, also when you take into account that they are made from a marble quarry that is located, you know, quite some distance from the sanctuary of Athena Alea, which presupposes at least a sort of control of the territory of some sort. So it's important also for that aspect. Now, the 6th century, and now I'm sort of passing on to the more thing about, you know, treaties, interstate relations, that topic, which is also important for saying something about state formation and the emergence of the polis. And these are, of course, very famous texts from Herodotus. First, the famous answer they got from the Pythia in Delphi when they wanted to make war on the Arcadians, and the Pythia said, "I will give you Tegea to beat with your feet in dancing, and it's fair playing to measure with a rope." And of course, the Spartans lost, and they were chained and were forced to work the area of Tegea for the Tegeans instead. But then a little bit further on, Herodotus says something, well, that they were unsuccessful, as this is a good example of. And in the time of Croesus and the kingship of Alexandrides and Ariston in Lacedaemon, the Spartans had gained the upper hand, he says. But still, they didn't really quite come to grips with the Tegeans, so they asked what they should do, and they should bring back the bones of Orestes, which then continues with the well-known story of Lycas stealing the bones of some superhuman, probably, in Tegea, and then the Spartans finally succeeded in sort of getting the dominion of the Tegeans, not really winning it in war, but at least winning their allegiance in alliance. Now, this is, according to Herodotus, is, well, it says in the time of Croesus, which means in the mid-6th century, more or less. Of course, we can all ask what sources Herodotus had for this, but at least that's the testimony of Herodotus. And of course, we have this other very famous and rather mysterious source, which is from Plutarch, where he asks who are the good among the Arcadians and the Spartans, and then he refers to a treaty set up in common on a pillar by the Alphaeus, and it was said that the Messenians must be expelled from the country and things like that. And the crucial question here is, of course, what does this mean? Pistus poein, to make people, well, I can't say Christs, but I mean, to make them sort of, you know, honored or whatever. And the original solution of Jacobi was to say that, okay, this means to make them citizens, that they shouldn't make Messenians citizens, which would make sense given the fact that Sparta had subjected Messenia for some time, and they didn't want Tegea as a neighbor state to sort of absorb Messenians into their citizen body. But that is not what Aristotle, how he interpreted it, but still, I mean, it is an important text because it is one of the really early interstate treaties, at least the fragment we have of it, in archaic Greece. The question is, of course, whether it is archaic or whatever it is. The original sort of suggestion was that was the mid-6th century and perhaps the start of the Peloponnesian League. But recently, someone has suggested that no, it's rather early 5th century. And that's mainly because the proponents of this theory is they feel that, okay, this is better suited to what we know about the history of the Peloponnese during the early 5th century in the Persian Wars. I think this is really not a very good argument because we know very much more about the early 5th century, generally speaking, and about politics than we do about mid-6th century. But I mean, it's uncertain when it can be dated, but it is important in any case, and it is important as a sort of treaty between Tegea and the Spartans. Now, I think one might fairly say that a successful Tegean resistance against Sparta, which at least Herodotus tells us in the 6th century, must presuppose a sort of fairly high number of soldiers, hoplites, psiloi, light armored, and consequently rather high population numbers. It's very difficult to believe how Tegea would be able to resist for some time the Spartans if they didn't really have a substantial sort of base, a manpower base. And influential work on Tegea from 2000 by Bjørn Forsén. He argues that in the 5th century, Tegea could perhaps muster about 4,500 hoplites, something like that, which in his calculation would mean perhaps 9,000 citizens. But of course, this is very hypothetical, as he obviously admits. He also, in the same study, thinks from the sort of the territory that Tegea controlled, that the maximum capacity in human terms of the territory could have been between 22,000 and 27,000. This is mainly based, I have to say, on the late 19th century census, but still, I mean, it does give some indication on the sort of, the capacity of the territory in terms of number of humans. Now, but what about this and the sort of state formation issues that is my main concern here? Well, as we said, or as I said, the urban area of Tegea is hardly before the mid-6th century and perhaps in late 6th century. So how was Tegea organized before that? Was it a polis at all? Was it something different? How was the whole area organized? Because it must have been organized in some way or another, given the fact that it was actually able to resist Sparta, which of course was well known already at this time for its military power. Well, about that, we really have, well, we have two sources. It's mainly Strabo and Pausanias. And Pausanias, I've only included him here. He says that the inhabitants dwelt in parishes or in Demes, and he gives the name of them all. But he also says that, but in the reign of Apheidas, and he has already then at that time given the genealogy of kings and the whole sort of mythic history of kings in Arcadia. And he says that the 9th parish was added to them, namely Apheidantes of the modern city Aleves was founder, he says. So at least we have the suggestion, I should say, that people were organized in demes, which is hardly surprising in a way. I mean, that's what we know from many Greek states. And that has led me to think that I showed you this map earlier with sanctuaries, and I'm thinking that we might be sort of mistaken by only thinking about sanctuaries as religious centers. Now, again, the urban area of Tegea. This is, in a way, one of the clearest examples, because this is identified as the sanctuary of Demeter in Corytensis, which is one of the demes. So it could very well be interpreted as a Demes center with a sanctuary, for instance. The same could absolutely be the case of the Temple of Athena Alea, particularly in the early period when we had these small cult buildings, which could easily have been made by one Deme and not by the whole sort of the whole area, as it's quite evident, I think, from the late 7th century stone temple. This is absolutely another candidate, the sanctuary of Demeter at Iosostis, particularly because some of our votive material from this area might have to do with initiations rituals, for instance, quite possibly, which could be another Deme center. And of course, it's quite possible that also the later Temple of Artemis in Doliamna marble might be another, sanctuary connected to Deme center. The perhaps most intriguing thing is this new, and I say new, not in terms of date, but newly found at least, small settlement with a sanctuary just south of Athena Alea. And I'm very happy for Mari Malmer for information about this. She has published a short note on this site, and I agree it's not a very good, but at least it gives the impression of the size of the density of material, and this is her interpretation of it. It's a site of approximately 3 hectares. And it's more or less continuous occupation from the 8th century BC to the 6th century AD. The most conspicuous category of finds were around 80 figurines, many of them a type usually dated loosely to the 7th, 6th century. Signe might know more about this. Although only a preliminary interpretation has been published so far, the site should probably be interpreted as a small village with a sanctuary, or perhaps even a workshop, which is exactly what we would sort of expect in a Deme center in the territory of Tegea. So I think we have at least, I won't say that it's proved, absolutely not, but we do have at least some ideas to suggest that there was some sort of organization of the territory in Demes before the urbanization happened. What we should term this sort of state formation is, of course, well, I won't suggest a new name for it, but it is clearly a sort of precursor to developed polis of sorts. And I think it is also accompanied by a few other important aspects about Tegea, and this is the problem of water. Tegea and the plains of Eastern Arcadia are notorious for their problems of water. And when I say problems of water, it's not because they have too little water, it's because they have too much. Because these are karstic plains, there are no natural outlets for the rainwater or the snow. That's why I chose this photo, because it shows it in winter. And you can easily see, I mean, it floods everywhere, more or less, during the winter. Which means that the plain, which is of prime agricultural land, I mean, it's important agricultural land, but for much of the year, it's very difficult to use, simply because it is flooded. And water is at Tegea a problem, and we have seen that during our work. These are our excavation trenches at Palais Episcopi in spring. And I mean, it's really a sort of, there's water everywhere in these plains in the spring, particularly in the spring, because then you have not only the rain, but you also have the melting snow in the mountains around, obviously. And that is, of course, a problem, but it is actually also a blessing, because, and you can see why here, because when you get water standing for some time, you get the formation of blue-green algae, which means that you get the natural fertilizer into the ground. So it makes also the area much more fertile, but you have to sort of deal with all the water, and you have to you have to do drainage basically to get the full potential of the area. And this is obviously also a problem when it comes to the archaeological situation. This is actually a rescue excavation by the FRIA showing the easternmost street of the city. That is the same area in spring. And my colleague, Jonathan here, is wondering, where is the street? Because it's, as you can see, covered in water, a huge swimming pool where the trench was earlier, and it is sort of bit with a melancholic mind. I have to see the photograph of Jonathan, who died prematurely at 44, only 6-7 years ago, but he was a really good collaborator in Tegea. Now, there are important changes in the landscape of Tegea. And this is our geologist who has sort of tried to figure out the prehistoric situation. This is a river coming from the south, going to the north, and to Katavotra, swallow holes further north. And the riverbed was definitely further to the west than it is today, because this is the present situation. It changed during antiquity. This is during the period of the town of Tegea, where it led around the town, more or less, from the south towards the north. And the interesting thing is that this situation persisted from somewhere around Archaic Classical period until the early Byzantine period. There was no substantial change in the drainage situation during this very long period. But in the later post-classical period, this changed completely, because then the river changed several courses many times, also going straight to the west, leaving a huge alluvial fan here, for instance. So it's very tempting to see that, you know, in this situation, the river and the drainage was kept in place by a community based on the plain in the town of Tegea. But in the later period, in the earlier period, or in the later period, when no such town existed in the center of the plain, then the situation was quite different. It was simply flooded basically all the time. So that means that I think there are reasons to believe that we are not only talking about, you know, urbanization at Tegea at a certain stage of time, but we're also talking about a sort of colonization of the plain in terms of agriculture. This meant that the really fertile areas of the plain could be, you know, the plain could be used for agriculture, giving quite a different sort of subsistence level for the population in the area, because they wouldn't then only have the foothills and pasturage and things like that in the area, but they also had access to really well-drained prime agricultural territory on the plain. So I think we are talking about a process here that goes, you know, the urbanization goes together with the drainage and the colonization of the plain and the control of the whole territory. So this is really, I think, and I believe, but that's basically a belief and not a certainty, that we are talking about sort of drainage colonization of the plain together with urbanization. And I think we should, and I'm getting towards the end now, should think about a very long process of state building, probably departing from small local communities or Demes. And the indications that we have on cooperation on common sanctuaries and against common enemies, for instance, against Sparta, at least from the 7th century, shows that this process is already underway in the 7th century, but it only finds its sort of, and this implies also, of course, some common political institution or aristocratic collaboration, or both, for that matter. And it finds its sort of result, or its final result, in the urbanization in the second half of the 6th century BC. This is, of course, highly hypothetical, and all of these processes, also actually the urbanization itself, are processes that would have taken quite a long time. I mean, we as archaeologists, we have a tendency to think that, okay, we have the earliest datable evidence we have is from the late 6th century, which means that in the late 6th century, everything was ready. It was sort of finished. But of course, making a city, making an urban grid would take considerable time. And archaeological finds in colonial foundations, for instance, shows this very clearly. I mean, we rarely have much archaeological information on the date given by Thucydides for colonial foundations, for instance. They are usually about a century later or something like that, simply because the whole process took quite a long time. It took a long time to sort of plan and to execute and to people the towns itself. And I think this is, for all these aspects I've talked about here, that is the case. It takes time. It takes a long time to get to the final result, which is the one that we are sort of very focused on, namely exactly when did it become a polis. Well, we can tell at the when we have the urbanization. We can't tell earlier. That doesn't mean to say that there was no state formation at an earlier date. And that is basically what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. And I would say, and as you have understood, that okay, we have been working at Tegea for about 35 years, or next year it will be 35 years. But we do actually need quite lots of more field work, particularly on the foothills, but also more in the plain. I mean, we need more everywhere, all the time. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you, Professor Ødegård, for this wonderful lecture. It's time for a Q&A. And so any questions? Who's going to be the brave one? Go on.
I can be the brave one for once. No, this is brilliant, and I think this idea of the Demes sanctuaries is if this is really the case, and it's very convincing, your argument, and we have a whole new concept that we can apply elsewhere as well, and I think it's really interesting. I would be interested to hear other people's opinion on it, but I think it was really fascinating. So I kind of have maybe a mean question,
Yeah.
because I'm thinking about the earlier period, because we have a huge sanctuary to Athena Lea that goes back to the geometric period, and even earlier.
Even earlier, yeah.
So what about the settlement for, that sanctuary? Where was that? We don't have any idea where that would have been.
No, and actually, the area of the sanctuary of Athena Lea is not very well suited for settlement. I mean, because it's it must have been an extremely wet area. In our what our geologist believes, and it's published in the 2 volumes of Erik Østby, he actually believes that the river went around the sanctuary at a certain stage. So it was not a good place to live, I would say, probably. It was a good place to meet at certain times of the year, absolutely, but not sort of, on a stable basis. And it could be, of course, that this new site that Mari Malme has discovered during her survey is, in fact, it belongs to that area. I mean, it's the sort of people were living up in the hills to the south, and there you get the sort of, well, this is not exactly where she was doing her survey, but you get an idea of the sort of the foothills around to the south of Athena Lea, and that could also be the case. I think the other candidates are sort of better suited, because the one near in modern day Steno, Ioitica, where the temple of Demeter was, for instance, is close to at least slightly higher ground. Iron solstice is on higher ground. So I mean, there the case I think is slightly better. But of course, I do understand that it's pure, just it's an idea. It can't be proved in any way. But we have this tendency to think about, because sanctuaries are often, better, they are better documented than settlements. And it means that when we find figurines with, oh, this is a sanctuary. But I really would like us to sort of, have a bit closer look at the sort of, what else do we have in the archaeological material? Because this could be, yes, something religious, I won't deny that, of course, but it could be a sort of that we are looking a bit in the wrong direction in a way. This could in fact be our indications on a sort of organized small community with the sanctuary, because at least that's what we know about Demes, generally speaking. They did have some religious focus almost always. But yeah, I get your point, and as I said, this is basically a sort of ideas. And
No, it's a great idea. And actually, if you think about it, maybe as we see the 8th century formation processes of communities as these clusters in sort of spread out in a landscape, maybe that's sort of the precursor for your idea for the late archaic Demes sanctuary. You need to come up with a good term for this.
Yeah, of course, it's not really my idea either, because when Mauro Moggi, when he speaks about the Greek synoikisms, he does say that, okay, this could be a precursor to what we get when people, when people synoikize and they go to get to form a city. And he also has this, which is also for him completely hypothetical, that it could be a sort of, cooperation between Demes of some sort. But his problem is the same as mine. I mean, we don't really have any sources for it. And even if we go to Athens, which of course is as always, our best documented example, it's also rather difficult, because I mean, we do know that the Demes existed, obviously, before the Kleistenic reforms, but there's a very, I mean, whatever their purpose was, did they have any political functions at all? Most scholars would say no. It's only with the Kleistenic reforms that they get political importance. So it's a very difficult question, really. But yeah. Other question? Professor?
It's a real question. Well, first of all, I'm sorry I couldn't join your talk from the beginning.
No, but that's...
So I came a little later, and I had the opportunity to think about the later phases and the development, as you very clearly showed to us how it became this long process. He brought us to a sort of an organized playing with communities, and I was thinking about the fact that just from Arcadia, we do have the earliest, belonging to the second half of the 6th century, coins, Archaic koinon. These are the first really Peloponnesian coins. Whereas, and as it's well known in the Peloponnesus, the Aeginetian coins, statues were in force for a long time. So this is also a clear evidence that something happened here which brought the communities together. We cannot speak of, there were not coins struck from cities, but from the whole. So that is evidence in another way.
No, I didn't touch your coinage. It's not my specialty, and I didn't really have anything new. But of course, the Archaic coinage is very interesting. The only problem is that it's so much discussion on, where was it formed? What does it mean? Is it some
it is a long
festivals or, yeah,
discussion.
it's a long discussion, so I
There
didn't
are
want.
so many articles about
Yes,
it, yeah.
yes, so I
Of
didn't want
course.
to bring up
But
it up here, but
in any case, it's a sign that something happened in the larger,
yes.
in the play,
Yeah.
which brought the
Yeah.
upper to a community at the end, sort of early city.
And I should say also that and I have discussed this with my colleague Anna Kalapaniotto several times. I do believe, but she knows more about Mantinea than I do. But I do believe that we might have a very similar situation there. But of course, it's and which would be in a way logical. I mean, they share the same plane, they have the same sort of particularities.
It's of course for the archaeological, there are the ideas of a certain means,
Yes, yes,
for means which are further on
yeah.
directly to the region of Elis and so on.
Yeah.
It is general Arcadian.
Yeah.
Let's think about that.
Yeah, and I think and I didn't really go into details about it, but the fact that you have at Tegea this and all the Arcadian centers, that you have this sort of double identities. You are Arcadians definitely, but you are also Tegeans or Monteneans or whatever. And of course that could also, the fact that this Arcadian identity is seemingly so strong at a rather early date, it could of course be from the simple fact that from the early date you don't have polis, you have these sort of more regional identities, which could be Arcadian of course, but they could also be Tegeans. I mean, they could have a sort of some sort of not only identity but actually also some sort of political identity together, because at least I think it's difficult to dismiss this ancient tradition of the hostilities between Tegea and Sparta completely. And if one is to accept it, it must be at least from the 6th century, if not even earlier. And it is rather difficult to believe that you could have a long period of warfare with Sparta without having some sort of communal cooperation of some sort. I think it's extremely difficult to believe, I think. I mean, Messene did definitely not manage this. So I mean, why did they do that in Tegea in Arcadia? Yeah, probably because this sort of state formation process had gone a little bit further in Arcadia than in Messenia. But as I said, this is really very much sort of theory, hypothetical questions. Other question?
Yes, I also found this very fascinating, and it's interesting to think about when you have this kind of ingredients to think about when you put them together at some point, you will have at least the possibility for polis or some kind of urbanization. But of course, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to happen it's not, there could have been other policies that kind of could have been. I was just reminded of, I think it's this kind of Deme relationships between Demes, the Tetrapolis and Marathon, where you have some kind of associations between Demes that doesn't really fit the later political structure, but still it kind of persists.
Yeah.
So then, so of course you have different kind of. You could think that you have kind of different relationships between Demes, and some of them will, at some point, it will say boom, and magic will be there, but it doesn't. Could have been otherwise, and you can't perhaps predict the way you talk about this kind of long and maybe zigzag process of organization.
No, I think because I've looked a little bit at the situation in neighboring Argos, for instance, which is definitely very different, but that's because there the center was, well, it was, if not always, it was there in a way. They had the common center from you know, with Mycenaean background and all that. It was no sort of, and you could say, of course, the same with Athens, that you had no sort of competitors in a way. That was the only site that was sort of could be the center. But at Tegea, apparently they didn't really have one. It must, in that case, it must have been the sanctuary of Athena. But in that case, it's also interesting that when they do found the city, they found it very close by, not exactly by the sanctuary, but still very close. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Lovely to hear about the investment. I have just a very practical question, and because I do like I really do like the idea to think of the formation processes in terms of this perhaps even coexisting different kinds of practices that might have been going on. My only kind of point is that, as you mentioned yourself, that we are quite prone to take our model from the context of we better know. Now you're talking about this. I mean, it's very clear that the Arcadian identity was there. But you use the term and I simply find the, for instance, the term Deme a bit kind of initiating because it comes from a different kind of model. So do you base it on any kind of even later epigraphical material? Would there be an alternative somehow to maybe term this settlement patterning structure? Because if we use the term Deme, so we quite automatically take as a kind of a model break from Athens, and that might be misleading. And so if there might be something different, what do you think? You say maybe with colonization. Okay, we know that this is a problematic term, and many but I'm not referring to that. But still, of course, with the term colonization, we think that who colonizes who, why. You know, these are simply sometimes quite refreshing to take a look in this type of fantastic context and take it as it is, and maybe think of would we be so brave that we could come up with a new new versions of terminology.
No, I mean perhaps I mean the reason I call them Demes is simply because Pausanias calls them Demes. So I mean I presume that must be because well, they were locally known as Demes, perhaps. That would be my at least guess. But of course, yes, I do agree. But that's when you talk about polis and institutions, you always get this problem of the Athens bias in a way, because I mean when it comes to polis formation, Athens is really, you know, it's the case, which is always used in a way. So it's very difficult to escape that sort of bias in a way. But what I do believe is interesting here is the simple fact that I think, and I hope you will agree with me, that I don't think there can be any doubt that there is some sort of state formation going on quite clearly earlier than the urbanization. And of course, and we can't really call it, you know, I think this early part an ethno state, because it's not really, I mean, it doesn't really comply with what's usually called an ethno state. It's something different. It's a sort of, it's a polis in the making, but it's not. But of course, it's also conceivable that it could have gone in the other direction, you know. So it's no, I see your point, but it's and of course, I mean, there are many scholars who have been working on, you know, similar problematics, but I don't think really we do have a good. I think it's unfortunately it's the sort of Aristotelian example that sets the sort of standard for how we think about Greek states, and it's very difficult to free ourselves from that sort of, you know, the model that the polis is the natural habitat for humans. It's we always see it in that perspective. And at least I haven't sort of been able to break away from that. But it would be interesting to try to, you know, try to have an idea that isn't really modeled on that old Aristotelian way of seeing things.
Could I just ask an ignorant question? This kind of long, this archaic city grid with this long blocks, are there theories about where they kind of came from, or how they, was there a function to this big agora?
It is, I mean, the very elongated blocks, for instance, is a standard feature in all colonial foundations in the archaic period. They can be longer than a Tegea. They can be even be a bit shorter, but usually that they are sort of, as I said, 1 to 3 or more ratio with length. The big public areas is a bit curious. That's interesting because we don't really see that everywhere, and we don't see it in the earliest foundations. It's mainly, at least from what I know, it's mainly a characteristic of Achaean foundations in southern Italy, particularly those of the second generation. I mean, we do know a little bit about Sibarius and the early Achaean colonies, but of course Metaponton and Poseidonia are the best documented ones. And there are actually a few other, I didn't mention that in my talk, but there are a few other things that are also very interesting. For instance, that they all have ecclesiasteria or theaters close to the agora. And that's the same at Tegea. At Tegea, the theater is Hellenistic, but on the other hand, the only real publication on the theater of Tegea by Valois from the 1920s says that there are remains of an earlier theater, sort of a bit more like Torikos or something like that, but it's in the same place. So it's near the agora. So there are a number of factors that are, and we don't really know. I mean, I saw a recent paper by Emanuele Greco who said that it's a curious phenomenon, but he didn't really give an answer to what is the thing about it. But now with also Tegea, we have 3 urban plans which are, you know, a century apart in date, more or less. So that's almost trend.
Because the Tegeans, at some point, they decided, let's do this.
Yeah.
Let's do it this way.
Yeah.
Let's do
And we don't know. I mean, why or where did they get the idea? Of course, it's very tempting to try to find some sort of, you know, Achaean identity or whatever, but that's very difficult to make, and it's even difficult to say what if Metaponto. Well, they did feel probably like Achaeans, but that was probably mainly because they had the Dorian neighbors in Taras. So I don't know. It's difficult to say. Another person.
Thank you very much. It inspired from your last slide. I was wondering if there are any current or future plans.
We have actually plans. As I said, Mari Malmer has been doing survey, well, not quite the last years, but at least until, I can't remember exactly last season, 2017 or something like that. Yeah. But we do, or we have at least tried to formulate some plans on further geophysical survey. Not only in the urban area, but also on other sites, like, for instance, this possible village site. So that's really perhaps the main, or at least the possibility or the probability that we will continue in that direction. As I haven't really spoken much about our excavation from 2010 to 14 in the Agora area, but that is basically because it's chronologically quite different. It's mainly late Roman. We do have a few contexts of the 4th century, but we didn't really get very far down, so we can't really. So there wasn't so much I could tell. The only thing I could tell was that we were able to see that, okay, geophysical map you saw of the streets is in fact correct. I mean, we did find the street exactly where it should be. So there's no question that it's, I mean, it's not fantasy on our part, but it is definitely archaeological fact. But I think that's the sort of, the probability is that we will continue in that direction in the coming years. We hope. We hope to, yeah.
Other questions? All right, so then we can continue our discussions during our reception. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.